welcome to another episode of the Competitive Enablement Show on the Compete Network, powered by Klue, the podcast for product marketers and compete professionals looking to give their companies a competitive advantage. I'm your host, Adam McQueen, and today's episode was the first CE Live of 2023, and we talked about delivering win-loss insights to your executive team. Ben, we're hot off the press. I'm kind of humming a little bit. I had a coffee while recording, but nothing beats the thrill of a live podcast episode.
Totally. People who answer their questions, they agree to come on camera. It adds such life to it and really reaffirms our war cry of this is not a webinar. And it just makes everything, makes the learning better, makes the experience more fun. Win-loss month is going strong, Adam. We're really going for it this month and frankly throughout the year. And it's so much fun for me to see that other people are as excited about win-loss as we are, because it just makes, the content we produce better. So I don't know, great job. Thanks to everyone again for coming out, asking your questions. It really does mean a lot and we appreciate it.
Yeah, the community show up in full force, and I'd be remiss to not even introduce the guests, the experts who joined me. We had Robyn Welfare, the Research Director at DoubleCheck Research by Klue. She's an expert in all things win-loss, working with customers to uncover trends in terms of why they're winning and losing, and then delivering that in a summarized format to their executive team. She's incredible at it. She goes into so many different examples. And then also Brandon Bedford, the man at Klue who uses Klue, the competitive enablement manager, co-host, might be taking my spot as host the way he kills it out there. And also running win-loss with Robyn at Klue.
Brandon added something to the iconic metaphor. And only Brandon could add something new to a metaphor and have it add to the metaphor. Because we talk, so Ryan Sorley, CEO of DoubleCheck, he mentions that when it comes to really informing your execs or your audience with win-loss insights, it harkens back to the metaphor. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can show them all the insights, you can make it clear, but it's kind of up to them to absorb the insights or not. But Brandon, I don't want to spoil it too much, but let's just say Brandon added something to that metaphor about how while you can't force them to drink, you can highlight and accentuate some of the potential downfalls of not drinking that water. So
dehydration for one.
We got to stay hydrated. Yeah. So it was, I can't wait for you guys to listen to this one. Yeah. It's always a good one when Brandon comes on. And hey, moderator Adam, I thought you did pretty well today too. I'm highly
a bit of rust.
Your abilities, but this was a good one, I thought.
I appreciate it. There was a little bit of rust, a little bit of hectic scrambling to find my mic this morning. But hey, I'm excited to kick it all off in 2023. And also for listeners, we mentioned in the recording an accompanying template, a win-loss executive summary template. We'll add that in the show notes to this episode as well. Essentially, we've made a customizable template that you can use yourself to deliver your win-loss insights to your executives. It follows the formula that the experts over at DoubleCheck use with all of their customers, and it really kind of helps you structure how you tell the story of all of the things you've learned from the win-loss research. So check that template too. If you hear about that in the recording, that's what we're referencing. Super relevant to the topic today. But with that all said, let's get into our first CE Live of the year with Brandon and Robyn. Let's introduce the people you actually came here for, my guests today. First off, we have Robyn Welfare, the Research Director at DoubleCheck Research, my coworker now.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Robyn has extensive experience doing exactly what we're going to talk about today, delivering win-loss insights to the execs, and she also built a win-loss program in-house as well. And we're also joined by a familiar face. I think he might just be the co-host now. I haven't formally popped the question yet, but I ping him and he says, yeah, fine, I'll do this, Adam. Can you just stop bugging me? It's Brandon Bedford, the Competitive Enablement Manager over at Klue, the man at Klue who uses Klue. And he runs the win-loss program in tandem with Robyn as well. So they have, Brandon, do you want to reveal the name around the Klue HQ about Brandon and Robyn's win-loss team?
Sure. Yes. I think our unofficial nickname right now is Brandman and Robyn. So, partners in crime, compete experts by day, win-loss experts by night, perhaps, something like that. But yeah, you're never bugging me, Adam. Always happy to be here and part of these conversations.
All right, so now we've done my spiel. We've got folks in attendance. I want to just kick things off with a couple questions to start with. We've got a few poll questions. Ben, do you want to drop the first one? I just want to get a sense of where folks are at with their win-loss program today. If you thumbs up, if you're seeing the poll. You're getting both questions. We have, where are you at with your win-loss program today? And which department head has been most vocal for win-loss insights so far in your organization? So give a couple seconds to answer these, get a sense of where most of the folks in attendance are at today, and that can help us kind of lead the conversation. Ooh, heavy sales focus. Sellers wanting win-loss insights checks out to me. All right, I'm going to share. Oh, you sharing the results there, Ben? Robyn, Brandon, first things first, which department head has been most vocal for win-loss insights? You see the results there? Anything surprise you, or is that checking out to what you've seen?
Seems consistent with our own program. But yeah, curious, Robyn, you've seen a lot more programs than I. What's your take there?
Yeah, that looks pretty much aligned. I'm a little surprised to see customer success on the lower side. I was kind of expecting to see that a little bit higher. So that's really interesting to me. But definitely sales is usually a strong driver there that we tend to see quite frequently.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of the poll. Let's get into some questions. So obviously, when we talk about delivering your insights, what you've learned about win-loss, your research to execs, that is sort of the end portion of win-loss. So I think we're starting at the end here. But Robyn, offline, you mentioned to me, there's a lot of things you got to do before that. And we don't want to dig too much into it, but off the bat, what's one of the most important things to do first to set yourself up for success when you eventually do present win-loss to execs?
Yes, thank you. This is a very, very, very important question. It's very near and dear to my heart. So I feel like if we take away one thing today, please remember this, is that before you start any research, you need to understand what your goalpost is. Like, what's that success goalpost for you, right? And in the win-loss churn analysis world, that's really understanding what your learning objectives are. So when I say learning objectives, I mean, like, what are the hopes and dreams for your leadership team or the stakeholders who are going to be looking at the information and observations and insights that you're pulling out of your program? It seems really obvious to kind of say, like, sure, you have to understand what success looks like, what that goalpost is. But I can tell you that in my experience, I've seen quite a few times where either that step was missed or we've rushed through it and we don't get really clear, like crystal clear about what it is, understand the whys behind it, what impact that's going to have on the organization. And if you don't do that, it's sort of like casting this really wide net, right? And all like potentially these great nuggets of information are just going to kind of slip through. But once you really kind of fine tune what you're looking for, you're able to really provide those meaningful results. Brandon, I noticed I think it was a LinkedIn post you had recently, excuse me, you had mentioned you had a phrase and it was something like, we could have done a million things. Does this sound familiar to you?
A little bit. Maybe keep going with that. It might jog my memory.
Well, I don't remember the actual post, so I apologize. But that phrase has really kind of stuck with me, and I feel like it's really relevant in our conversation today. So like when you're thinking about a win-loss program and you're starting out, it's really easy to get excited and think, oh, we're just gonna set a net out there, get as many interviews as we can, and we'll just share those results with the team. But I urge you all to not start with the million things, like really get crystal clear on what those stakeholders want to know, and then use those as your guide, your compass, if you will, to build your research materials and really steer your program.
I think it's coming back to me now. Sorry, I'll just chime in. I think I'm recalling the post. It was about like prioritization, and I think it applies to win-loss, but it also applies to, I'm assuming, a lot of product marketers here that have a lot of different priorities. And by, that learning objective step, I think is so critical. And really sifting through a menu of a dozen or 100 different things that you could look for in a win-loss program, and choosing the key things that not just you care about, but your executives care about. So I know, like, for our own program, which obviously, Robyn, you've been instrumental in helping us build from the ground up. Like, that initial step was so critical in the rest of the program being a success.
What are some of the questions that you two ask then? You mentioned, like, you need to hone in. So what are some of the examples people in attendance can go and take themselves to ask their executives to dial in from, we could do everything, we could boil the ocean, to, like, these are the things we really actually want to learn about?
Right. So the first step is engaging with your stakeholders, right? And we do see a lot of times that doesn't happen. So make sure you're engaging with them. Ask them questions about, what are their hopes and dreams? Why the heck are we doing this win-loss or churn analysis program? And then put your curiosity hat on, right? You got to dress for the occasion, and you need to ask them why. Like, why is this important? What impact is this going to have on the organization? And what are we going to do with that information or observations when we get them? So I think it's just really, thinking about those 5 whys, if you will, like really peeling back that onion to understand what those impacts are. And you're ultimately understanding, like, what they want to know. So when you end up getting to your exec summary stage, or you've closed your sample and you're sharing the results, it's going to really hit home, because you're hitting on exactly what they want to know.
Yeah, I'll maybe just piggyback on that to your point, Robyn. Like, I think the questions are almost less important than actually just doing it at all. And I think you kind of you said it in a slightly different way, Robyn, but I think it's the same message, that just by engaging our executives as step 1 in our program, it brought them to the table, so that when we had our results from our first win-loss cohort, they knew what to expect, and they were already kind of bought into the program. So, I would almost, maybe this is a, hot take, typical hot take, Brandon here, but the questions are actually less important than just asking some questions at the initial stage of the program, because you're getting that buy-in from executives, so that they know that, hey, we're doing this thing. This is going to be impactful. Tell me what's most impactful for you, so that we can deliver on it.
Mm-hmm. And I'd also offer, like, the alternative, right? So say you do cast your net wide and you don't take this first step, which, again, I urge you not to do. But if you did, I think that when you go to share the data, you're going to hear things like, well, this is really interesting, but, like, what do I do with this? And how do I make sense of all of this? Like, what impact am I going to make for the team or the organization? I think there's a lot of more questions that come out of it than inspiration, if you will. And I think that you can kind of use that as like a meter as you're sharing what's coming out of your program, to really understand, are you hitting on those learning objectives or not?
I think so. There was a question from Jane. I think she's got, like, a little eye on my own question sheet here, because this kind of dovetails into mine. And maybe it is, from what I'm hearing from you both, like a bit more of a case-by-case basis. But she wanted some examples of, like, what could these typical learning objectives be when you're engaging your executives?
So typical learning objectives. So we kind of, when we think about win-loss, we're running through sort of like the evaluation journey of the buyer. So, for example, you want to understand everything from their challenges to how they're thinking about different vendors and solutions, how they're thinking about your product and solutions. So when you're thinking about that framework, you might have a lot of curiosity on a product you're launching. And you're like, hey, we want to really test and see, like, is this really resonating, or is the messaging resonating? We may have a big turnover in our sales team. So we want to understand, like, are they really being effective in their communications? How are those demo experiences? Are they really resonating with the buyer? I could go on and on and on about different learning objectives, but it's really, I guess my advice would be, like, when you're talking with your leadership team and those stakeholders, understanding what the corporate strategy is and then really aligning with that.
How has that been in your experience, Brandon, running win-loss from scratch, like starting this up? For context as well, folks, building our win-loss program. How long have we had the win-loss program over at Klue in play?
Well, we're coming up on a year, I think. I think it was around, I want to say, April of last year when we kind of officially engaged DoubleCheck for the first time and kind of courted each other, if you will. But prior to that, and I think this might resonate with anyone that's like kind of trying to do win-loss on the side of their desk. Like, prior to that, we were doing win-loss interviews, but they were incredibly ad hoc, right? You know, a sales rep or a customer success manager on the renewal side would say, "Hey, Brandon," or they'd ping my director, Jason Oakley. Many of you would know. "Hey, Oakley, like we have this prospect that we won or lost against, and they're open to an interview. Would you like to interview them?" And so it was very one-off. There was no structure around it. There were no learning objectives. There was no engagement with other stakeholders. And then we would get perhaps a couple of interesting nuggets, but to Robyn's point, it doesn't really go anywhere. Maybe it gets stored somewhere in Klue or in a document. Whereas now we have kind of a structured program where executives have said, "Hey, we're looking for XYZ when it comes to product feedback. We're looking for XYZ when it comes to sales process feedback or pricing feedback, et cetera." And so now we have this kind of roadmap, if you will, for the program as it gets built out.
That makes sense. And I believe as well, there is sort of this coverage map, which can kind of give you a long look on different learning objectives you could potentially be looking for. It's on DoubleCheck's website, actually, under their solutions page. So if you want to check that out too, if there's just some examples of the learning objectives you could be going for, that can probably spark some conversation as well. There's a few other questions in here. And again, people are getting my questions before even I do. So I love this. And I'll start with my own question, Robyn, about sort of the next process around spotting trends and kind of digging through sort of the quantitative and qualitative data. As someone who's doing this at DoubleCheck for customers, what does that process look like for you?
So I guess I'd like to kind of just preface this with a bit of a journey, if I can, to kind of put it into perspective. This is really how I think about it. And I think it also answers this question that I get asked a lot, which is, should I be sharing things as they're bubbling up, or should I be waiting until the end to share this information? So let me just take you on a quick journey. A few years ago, I came across this really great data influencer. He's just very passionate about data. His name is Brent Dykes. If you have a chance to read his book, it's fabulous. Effective Data Storytelling, really great guy. He had an article in Forbes magazine a few years ago, and he talked about this data journey. And it really kind of hit home for me. And it's really how I think about our win-loss journey too. So just really quickly, to put it into perspective, he talks about 4 steps in the journey. So you've got data, and you've got information, and then you have observations. And then the last piece of it is where the magic happens, right? Is the actionable insights. And when you think about putting that, like, let's just give an example. I think in his article, he was talking about Fitbit, right? So your data is the steps you're doing every day. Your information is being able to look at a dashboard and say, "Oh, look, here are all my steps." An observation could be, "Hey, last week I did 18,000 and today I did X amount," right? But I just want to kind of say, like, those aren't actionable insights. That's just part of the data journey. And I find a lot of win-loss programs kind of end there, and they don't get to that juicy actionable insights piece. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about this. But where the real juice of this is really getting to those actionable insights. So when you compare that to win-loss, you've got your data, which are your reports. You're seeing, your data bubbling. Maybe you have a dashboard, or maybe you're looking at some qualitative in a quantitative way, if you will. But where the real magic happens is starting with those observations. So you're able to create stories about what you're seeing and add context to it. Again, we just talked a lot about learning objectives. You need to be able to apply that to the data as it's coming in. Again, adding that context. And then eventually over time, you're able to make those actionable insights, right? And you can only do that by really digging in and understanding what those learning objectives are. So I think this was a long-winded way of saying yes, connect your people, your stakeholders to the data as it's happening, but be really mindful of what you're communicating. So if it's a piece of data or report, make sure you frame it in that way versus an observation, which is hey, this is something that we're seeing. We're not quite done doing the analysis, but we think this is interesting to know, versus we've done our sample and we're really confident here, and here's what we can do about it.
Brandon, this is a good, interesting conversation, I think, as well. Framing win-loss isn't just a series of interviews. It's not just looking through CRM data. It's sort of like a culmination of them all, this combination of quantitative, qualitative, and then being able to, like you said, make that magic and deliver actual actionable insights from all of these different kind of signals that you're hearing. Brandon, has there been, in your example with Klue right now, has there been anything you've noticed kind of connecting those dots?
Yeah, like I guess I totally hear you in terms of like qualitative and quantitative, and then to Robyn's point, it's one thing to kind of map them together. It's a whole other thing to turn that into an actionable insight. And again, not to beat a dead horse too much, but those learning objectives is what helps you find those paths to something that can be actionable. If I were to come up with like a hypothetical scenario here, right? Not from our own Klue program necessarily, but let's say through your win-loss program, you find out that you're winning a lot in the enterprise or up market, and you want to dig into that. That then will direct perhaps your program entirely. Maybe you're going to ask different questions, and that's what's going to get you actionable insights for, say, your enterprise team, maybe your sales team or your product teams, what have you. But without that, you are kind of a rudderless ship. And so again, not to keep coming back to the learning objectives, but I think it's super critical. And then maybe to segue to your question, how I think that relates to like the qualitative to quantitative, I think that, how do I put this? The depth of the interview, the depth of insight from a win-loss interview is so powerful. But if you don't have that structure, you'll miss out on a lot of the depth, right? And we talk about this a lot when we think about win-loss programs. I think a lot of win-loss programs get started with CRM data, right? You have kind of high quantity, very quantitative data, but perhaps low quality, right? It's sales reps that are self-reporting. That obviously has data issues there inherently. Oftentimes data is missing. You don't have necessarily good data in CRM, but you do have a large sample size, right? You could have dozens, hundreds, thousands of opportunities in your CRM, but that depth of insight that you get from a win-loss interview, that you're going to find things that you wouldn't have found by going through a million CRM deal notes. And I think it's that marriage of the two is where you can maybe hypothesize using some CRM data. But even then, like I would even just caution people from doing that, and just banking on that, because through these interviews, you're going to find things that you didn't expect. And I think that comes from the depth of an interview that, you could, maybe you get lucky and you find some, great nugget in CRM, but more than likely you're going to have that quantity, but you're not going to have that kind of quality there.
Yeah, I think using your CRM is maybe a guide that maybe you look at to kind of understand where you're going to turn, but I wouldn't lean on it as heavily as doing the qual and the quant together. And again, like using them together is very powerful, right? One adds, like your qualitative adds this deep, rich context. It really helps paint the picture. And I think I'd also be remiss to say, like, without that, you're not bringing the buyer's voice to the table. So like the CRM data that you have is very much from the shoes of your internal organization, and it's not in the shoes of your buyer and the mindset of your buyer, right? And that's really important. You want to build the empathy with your buyer base and really understand from their perspective how they're thinking about it. That's the whole point of win-loss.
Totally. If I could add one last thing, Adam, I know you're trying to get us to the next question, but good. This is it sounds like it's off topic, but I promise it's relevant. A shout out to Daniel Frank on our legal team, who recommended this book to me called Super Forecasting, which talks about how different types of people will look at data in different types of ways. And when you think of, the pundits that, become famous, anchors in the news, it's typically not because they're good at taking in lots of different types of input. It's because they see the world in a certain way, and it, that sells to their audience. And the analogy he uses in the book, the author talks about, is like, imagine like in the Wizard of Oz, putting on those green tinted glasses. You see everything as green. There was no Emerald City, but you see everything as green. And so by relying on CRM data, you're looking at all of your win-loss data through the lens of your own company, through the lens of your own sales team, your own customer success team. And they might be onto something, like that is still a win. Don't get me wrong, to get inputs from your revenue teams, but they could be missing something entirely because they see everything through the lens of your own company. And so I think I've been thinking of that analogy a lot as it pertains to win-loss, because we're all wearing glasses that are tinted with the shade of our own company and our own point of view. And having that win-loss insight, especially from a third party that can be neutral, is super powerful in, taking off those glasses.
Can I ask you a quick question regarding this? This is exactly like what I'm kind of struggling with right now, right? Because I'm trying to work off of the data, right? Like the CRM data, and sales and solution engineers, they're very busy. So sometimes those fields don't get, filled in, completely, 100%, right? And and it makes it a bit difficult, right? But the part about the interviews is, how do you go to an exec, right, and say, I've even done 20, 30, 40, 50 interviews, right? And this is what this is what the data that I'm getting, or the sentiment that I'm getting, right? And how do you respond to something from that C-level that says, this is not a big enough sample, right? We're looking for those hundreds of data points, or whatever, right? Because the main goal for me, for example, is, which competitors are we winning and losing against the most, and why? Like, what's the reason for it, right? So I guess, how do you overcome those things?
Sure. And sorry, how does that tie into the CRM data piece of that? I just want to make sure I have clarity there. So you shared sort of your two main learning objectives, and then with the CRM data, just repeat that just so I'm crystal clear on that.
So on the opportunity level, we have like a field that's called competitor, right? So if a competitor comes up during that opportunity, it gets filled in, and then I can track how many, which competitors are being talked about in which opportunity. And then I can filter on closed loss, closed won, and you also have a deal lost reason attached to it, right? Sometimes these things are not, filled to the best level of accuracy. But this is what I'm relying on the most, right? So that's how it ties in.
Right. And then your question is about how you present the data to the leadership team, and they're questioning the sample size. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, like, how do you overcome the fact that, the amount of interviews that you can do, right, may only give you like a small picture as to what's actually happening amongst all of these closed lost opportunities, right? Like, and we've also struggled getting people to have an interview after they've already closed lost, right? That's quite difficult. So the number of interviews that I can do is way smaller than the data set I have from the CRM data.
Right. So I guess I think my answer here is, when you're thinking about your CRM data, you've got your learning objectives, you're obviously pulling prospects out of your CRM to help support that program. And then depending on, I'm not sure what your sample size is, I would recommend that you're going to need, you're not going to be able to pull one or two and do an interview and be able to draw some trend analysis there. You're going to need a much bigger sample. Our recommendations, usually you need 10 at least in the same very clear cohorts, right? You need to make sure in this particular case, they're all with that competitor, they have the outcome, etc. And then when you're presenting that data to the team, you're just framing the sample. You're saying, hey, we know this is a sample size of, let's say 10. This is what we found. And we could say, here's the reasons that we saw in the CRM. Here are the reasons that we saw from the buyers. And then you can tell a story around that and share the buyer perspective. And I think adding that, again, that buyer voice and the empathy, I think it's hard to argue that from a leadership perspective. But Brandon, do you have any insights as we're thinking about our...
I totally agree with everything you said there, Robyn. The other thing that maybe my brain latched onto in what you mentioned there, Klue, is you kind of mentioned two learning objectives, if I heard correctly. One was, which competitors are we winning and losing most against, and then why? And I think the which question, that might be an example of a learning objective where actually you do want quantity, right? You want to look at CRM data and find, to Dustin's analogy, use that as a radar to say, okay, looking at our CRM data, we have a pretty good sense, even with low CRM data hygiene, that like this competitor is coming up more than this competitor. But it's the why type questions, or how come type questions, that I think the interview is just unparalleled to what a sales rep is going to put in. So I appreciate the question, because it does not that I don't want this to sound like it contradicts what I said earlier, but to take it with a grain of salt, depending on your learning objective. Because if your learning objective is to get a sense of, out of a large sample size, who we're losing against, then of course you do want a larger sample size. In terms of addressing the pushback, I think the piece that Robyn mentioned that I'd highlight is narrowing the sample size. So if you have a sample size of 10, that can be really valuable if they're all, say, enterprise clients and they're all in North America and they're all of a certain buyer persona. But if you have 10 and one's an enterprise company, one's a mom and pop shop, one's a software company, one's a pharma company, that's going to be less valuable. And so that again comes back to kind of how you're, the answer kind of starts in how you're beginning the program, if that makes sense.
I have a question as well for you, Klue, in terms of how you're presenting those qualitative stories. I think I know one thing that was powerful for me when Brandon shared our win-loss is, sure, it's a sample size of 10, but there was like the trends that Robyn and Brandon shared. But then one thing that was impactful was just actually getting the snippets of 10 different interviews saying the same thing on like why we won these deals in this specific segment. And granted, 10 is a lot less than 200. But when you hear someone saying it over and over again, that element for me kind of was like, oh, this is more impactful. It like sticks in a different way than just the numbers alone. I know you kind of have to have both.
Yeah, and then just to add to that, it's again not just that surface. Like we're not taking the okie doke, right? Like we're not saying, oh, why did we win or lose over this competitor, and say, okay, we're digging in and we're peeling that onion back and we're getting to those 5 whys. And when you get into those whys and they're all the same, that's pretty powerful content.
Yeah, and just to paint the picture here, just to give Robyn full credit for what she did in our program. So again, imagine a cohort of 10 interviews. And to your point, Claude, I think it's sample size of 10, 20, even you mentioned, I think 40, 50, there might be some criticism around sample size if you were to come in and say 8 out of 10, chose the competitor for XYZ reason. But what Robyn, excuse me, what Robyn did was she took snippets from the interviews and and created a little compilation video and then shared that live with our executive team. And so hearing 8 times in a row, physically, like literally from the buyer's mouth in a single video was really impactful and landed way more than just saying, 8 out of 10.
Ready, go get some water.
Yeah.
Thank you, Claude. I really appreciate it. That's a great question. And that was, I love that one. Alina also had a similar question. It was more on that kind of like deriving insights. I think we talked about about 10 minutes ago around like you've got all of these different signals, all of this different information, but how do you drive it into insights? And Alina had a question on that topic. You want to jump on, Alina?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for taking the question. Mine was specifically, Robyn, you mentioned in your earlier words, you spoke about evaluating demo conversations or just, I imagine generally sales calls. That is, even with the tools, I'd really love to hear how you approach it, both from a practical standpoint in terms of collecting the data, analyzing the data, and drawing the insight. Just for me, I find it like the most kind of, let's say, time consuming and effort heavy part of both win-loss, but, CI work in general. And I'm just, I guess, looking for tips.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Question for you before I answer is, you mentioned that the sales piece was more challenging for you than, I'm assuming, a different part of that puzzle. Am I understanding that correctly? Or is it overall?
Yeah, I think CRM data is pretty straightforward. And anything that's kind of, let's say, written or shared and kind of, I don't know, is in the company folders in one way or another is the easy part. That's something that you can go through pretty easily. A lot of it you can also, ingest in large quantities. But in terms of, following up, and even with tools like Gong and, Chorus, Wingman, whatever, I just wonder if how you use those in your win-loss, and if you have any tips on how to approach that in a kind of smart, more efficient way.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying. I appreciate it. So I guess the way I'd like to answer that is, the Gong and other resources, those are other ways to strengthen data that you're pulling from your win-loss program. So if I use your sales example, right? So say you want to, maybe your learning objective is understanding how efficient you are in the sales process. So you're going to make sure you ask a lot of questions about that in a win-loss interview, but you're also going to have a lot of questions really fine-tuning that experience in a survey as well. So again, you're coupling your qualitative, your quantitative data together. And then from there, once you're developing that story, you're in the observation stage, you're adding context to that data. That's when you can start bringing in your other resources like Gong, like, hey, and we have this call that we can use to support this, etc. That's how I would use those sort of supplemental resources to help support your win-loss or churn program. Is that helpful? Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you would treat it like you would interviews, like small sampling, kind of a special treatment. But yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Brandon, do you have a take on that as well?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, but I think the thing that I think of too is, if I understood what you're saying there, Lena, like there's the kind of customer interview, but then there's also this kind of rich data in these call recording tools where you can hear not only the buyer's take, but also how maybe your sales team is presenting. I think there's actually an opportunity there to partner with the sales organization, whether that's, individual sales reps or sales managers or sales enablement, because I think that's going to align pretty closely to a lot of their goals as well. And, that goes back obviously to learning objectives, but with that specific example, I think, your win-loss program might identify, some feedback around the sales process that could then be a conversation starter to work closer with sales enablement. And again, I know every organization is structured a little bit differently, but I would imagine those stakeholders are spending a lot of time in those tools already. And so as opposed to you having to kind of start again from scratch and, sift through Gong or Chorus and look for those call recordings yourself, you could kind of partner with them, and they might already have started to form a picture of where the team needs to improve certain skill sets, and you can kind of marry your findings with them.
Thank you for that question, Lena. I really appreciate that one. This is a good conversation going. I want to pivot a little bit to sort of this like storytelling element. Like, how do you actually deliver this to execs? I think we've talked about finding meaningful trends, identifying the key learning objectives, but there's also there's an art to how you actually deliver this to your stakeholders in a way that's going to stick with them and drive change, or not necessarily always drive change, but make an impact on decisions that are being made. So Robyn, do you have any tips in terms of condensing all of this information, all of these trends into a consumable format or story for your executive team?
So number one, start with your learning objectives. I'm sorry, guys, but you really need to start there. This is why they signed up for the win-loss program. So if you're not covering those, we're not going to be delivering an effective program. So make sure you cover those. So what I like to do is start with the learning objective as your core, and then I build a story around it. And you can even think of it as building a story or a script, right? You've got your characters and you've got challenges and they're building up to a climax. What is that tipping point where they start looking for a new solution? You can build it like a story, and within the story, you're taking your stakeholders on this sort of buyer evaluation journey, if you will. So as you're doing this, you're creating empathy. You're really putting your buyer's experience out there for the stakeholders, rather, to really listen to and engage with. But you're sprinkling in the other information along the way to really tell the story around those learning objectives. You also want to make sure you understand, are your stakeholders, are they very formal? Are they very informal? How do you present that data? Are they very data driven and they need to see all of the numbers? You obviously can support that in charts, but also in the appendix as well. Or are they more collaborative and conversational and want to have a conversation about the findings? So you really need to understand who those stakeholders are, what their interests are, and then how they consume information. That's where I would start. So in the case that Adam shared, videos are really great. I find that videos are underutilized in a way to share information. I think in today's world, we're all pivoting at a rapid pace. And if you can have a short snippet that really hones in on that learning objective and tells the story, I think that's really powerful. And then you can tell the story around it based on your other findings.
Brandon, how's that been in the case of Klue? The use case of doing this with a Klue executive team?
I mean, I can obviously only really speak for our own program, but I'll just maybe share an anecdote to kind of emphasize that point that Robyn made, which is when we do our executive summary readout, which is where, if you leverage the template that we shared earlier, you can, build this out yourself, but that's really summarizing those trends into kind of that storyboard format. When Robyn presented that initially to our executive team, we had booked an hour in their calendars. And let me tell you, finding 1 hour in a bunch of executives' calendars is quite the Tetris game. It ended up going an hour over that. And most executives stayed on. And so now we actually booked 2 hours aside. And again, not every team is going to be like that. But, that was something we recognized from the very first readout. Okay, our team likes to talk, likes to discuss things and really, collaborate and almost debate in real time versus just kind of taking it all in and taking notes. So now we set aside 2 hours for the executive summary readout. So yeah, RIP their calendars, but yes.
How do you make the most out of your time with them then as well when you get into that room? Robyn, Brandon, you've done this many, many times. You have a broader sample size than Brandon's of one, but like it would be really interesting to see. Yeah, you have a finite amount of time or opportunity to deliver all of this information to your executive team, and how are you making the most out of the time you have with them?
Right. So I think the first thing is the partnership that you have with your program leader. So in this case, Brandon and Jason Oakley were our program leaders, and I leaned on them heavily to make sure, number one, they understood what was coming. So connecting them to the program as it's bubbling and as the data is growing, right? Making sure that they're really connected to that, and then making sure they feel enabled to share that internally at the organization. So number one rule here is that you never want to go to an exec summary and surprise your program leaders with some findings. If that's happening, I think we need to kind of back it up and figure out why. You always want to make sure they're connected to that data, right? And then, from my experience, spending maybe 15 minutes talking through the story with some slides. Obviously, there's an appendix there. We have all the information if someone wants to dig in, but this is really just about telling the story and then opening it up for conversation. Like, hey, was this a surprise to you? Like as we're talking through the nitty-gritty and we're peeling back those whys, like, was any of this really interesting? Where can we dig in and dig our heels in and even find, in an additional sample rather, like how can we build on this data and make it even more meaningful? And I think that's sort of, we're all here to talk about a meaningful exec presentation. And I think it's bringing all that in a consumable way, but then also understanding like how can we grow this into something even better?
Yeah. And again, I'll just disclaimer before I speak here that this is, again, anecdotal based on just our program. But I know, Adam, you had asked me, both of us before the CE Live, like, how do you kind of prep the execs beforehand? And honestly, my answer is I don't. And so I want to clarify what Robyn said there, like making sure the program owners, myself and Oakley, know what to expect so that we can help, massage and manage the conversation. But the other senior leaders, I don't want to spoil the ending for them, right? Like there's this whole story that's gone into how these findings were received. Like I almost think of it as a thriller movie in a sense, I'm a big fan of psychological thrillers. I don't want to just send them the Wikipedia article and show them exactly how the movie ends. And so I actually don't prep them very much. I might give them a bit of a teaser, right? I want to provide them enough of an agenda so that they know what we're talking about. Like, hey, we're discussing XYZ cohort. Here's what we focused on this cohort, but I'm not spoiling the surprise so that, Robyn can really effectively tell the story and say, voila, here were our big findings. What is your reaction to that? And so I think, just wanted to share again, just from our experience. I don't know if that would work in every program, but I think that's how I kind of think about approaching it for our own team.
And then I think too, like as far as the style goes, sometimes you want to share the answers to those learning objectives in the beginning, right? You want to say, here's what you wanted to know. Here's what we found. Let's just pause a second and take you back through the journey so that they have the answer in their head and now they're connecting it throughout that journey. But then there's going to be other times when you might have some stakeholders that have a really strong bias and they're really confident, right? And the research has come out and we're like, actually, we're finding something different. We're very confident in the data that we have. Sometimes it's better to take them on the journey. And then when you get to that piece where that bias exists, it's like hit them with it, right? Because now they've built this empathy and they're like, yep, we're expecting this to happen. And then all of a sudden it doesn't. And then just really bring it home, like give some strong data pieces, do that video to really again, connect them to the buyer. So two different kind of styles that I use, if that's helpful.
I love that. Kind of you, rather than coming in right away like, I disagree with your take, that immediately puts people on the defensive and you kind of become more entrenched. But if you lead to this, you're pretty much building like the logical reason as to why this is the actual win reason, loss reason, whatever that finding may be. And again, I think whenever you mention this, Robyn, you say that empathy of the buyer's journey, like really just the purpose of this is to give a lens into what the buyer's gone through throughout that whole sales process. What about putting this stuff into action? I think we deliver this to executives. You have this great conversation, you reveal maybe some insights, but how does that actually get put into their work? How do we make sure that functional leaders and subsequently like their departments are taking the information that comes to them on a quarterly, biannual basis, and actually directing how the department operates? That's a whole nother, that's a tough task.
Sure is. I would say from on the researcher's side or perspective, it's our job to understand what the hopes and dreams are of the program and make sure we're delivering on them. At the end of the research sample, we'll always say, here's what we found, here's why it's important, and here's our recommendation on potential impact that you can make within the organization. But it's not my job. I don't work I do work for Klue now, but prior to that, if there was something that came out of the program, I couldn't, go hop in Brandon's shoes and take the lead on that, right? So it's a bit challenging from the research perspective because you can share this information and create some, excitement, if you will, or, you're bringing all this information or observations, actionable insights, hopefully, to life. But then your job is to really just keep reminding them of it and making sure that you're being clear about why this is important and connecting them to that data piece. But Brandon, I'm curious if you have the same perspective or.
Yeah, I think I see Ryan Storley in the audience here. And so just to share a little quick story from our onsite. So we had our all company onsite, the whole DoubleCheck team came out, the Toronto team flew out to Vancouver. And at the onsite, Ryan mentioned the analogy of leading a horse to water, but you can't force them to drink. And so I'm going to try to build on that analogy because I think it's a great analogy for making sure they action on the insight. It's we want to lead the horse to water, but also be very clear around what we think might happen if you don't drink the water, right? And I think that's where you can tie in the win-loss to your compete program as an example, right? To show data to say, hey, here are competitors that we're winning or losing against. Here's our opportunity in XYZ market. We now have these findings. Let's drink from this water, right? We can't force them to take action on these things. They are ultimately the functional leaders. But I think by really painting that strong picture, we can do a lot to make it really clear around what this decision means and just how impactful it can be. Whether it's, hey, avoid this big pain in the future or reap this large reward.
I love that. That's really great. And the other thing I would say too is how much of these assumptions or beliefs did your organization have without putting data behind it? And now you can be data driven with your win-loss program, right? You've got this qual and this quant data, you're putting it together and you're packaging it up like data driven versus assumptions that you're making from CRM data or just, hey, we believe this sounds good, right? I'm sure that's not happening, but I just wanted to kind of hone in on the point, the data driven piece is important too.
And Brian dropped it in the chat, and it's actually a part of the template that we dropped at the start of the session today. Is that sort of, okay, what are the action items? Who are the owners? What are the timelines? And a baseline metric. I think we've all been in meetings where there was a bunch of good stuff, and then you left and realized that it was not an agreed action plan following. And so really adding that sort of, here's what we suggest, and I'm sure throughout the conversation there might be some agreement on. This is some of the things, the actions we want to take. Yeah, exactly. Like a racing model. So I think that's a good example you can check out in the template as well. I've got there's a lot of questions from the audience, and actually Raina as well before the session asked me this, and this is a little separate to the delivering insights, but again, I want to touch on audience questions. It's really around incentivizing interviews, particularly I think Paige mentioned as well, sort of lost deals in particular. But Robyn, Brandon, could you give some advice, especially with the folks that are starting out, how you incentivize interviews?
Yes, I would. If you're starting out and you're doing this in-house, I would suggest start by not incentivizing. I think you might be surprised how many people might just want to share their story and be heard. If that's not successful for you, incentivizing is a great thing to do. You could suggest that you would make a charitable donation on their behalf, or you could offer a certain amount for an incentive, especially, to your point, the losses are a little bit more challenging than the wins, right? The wins are hey, by having this conversation, we might be able to inform our experience where the losses may have moved on, and it's a little bit trickier to kind of get their attention. So I would first of all, I would start without incentives. I've been successful with that in the past, but then there is a point where you're like, yes, we definitely need to think about incentivizing the program.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of there, maybe slightly off topic, so I don't want to open up a can of worms here, but I think by having a more kind of personalized or warm outreach can also go a really, really long way. You know, we hear from a lot of programs, whether they're, you know, doing it themselves or they're leveraging some other third-party partner, is they want to automate the ask sequence, right? And automate it and say, hey, here's $100 gift card, you know, respond to this survey, you know, insert first name. And don't get me wrong, it saves your team a lot of time in that kind of automated approach, but I think you will lead to less valuable insights that way. And I think at least, and I don't know if this is something we do for all programs, but for our own team, we have, for example, in the example of a loss, you know, yes, we lost their business, but they still have a relationship potentially with the sales rep that they evaluated Klue with. And so we'll actually have the sales rep send that first touch point. It's a template that we provide, but they can add their own personal flavor. And then the DoubleCheck team will follow up beyond that. And again, seems like a small change. And yes, you do need to get a seller to send that out, but you'll have a much better response rate and I would think a much warmer conversation than you know, a kind of templated survey, you know, that's incentivized with $100 with an Amazon gift card or something like that.
And I would also say too, if you're over incentivizing, what do you think I question like what those results would look like? Are they just in it for $100, or say maybe you increase it to 200 to get them to participate? Like what kind of results are they going to share with you? Like what kind of insights are they going to share? Or are they just in it for the cash? Just a consideration.
The amount of cash incentives I've had to take demo calls, take an intro call, all of these things. Like I get it and it makes sense, but at the same time, I think that's a good point, Robyn, that and you can buy my time with $50 worth of coffee any day. It is a good point.
Ooh, cheese would work for me, yeah.
Cheese. What kind of cheese are we sending you, Neil? It's good to see you in here too. Raina has a good question follow up here as we're wrapping up. Raina mentions like, what's your expected sort of reach out to response rate? I think I remember Ryan mentioning to try and increase that is lean a little bit more on your wins, maybe like a 2-to-1 ratio to start, because it's probably more likelihood they'll reply. But what's typically you've seen from that outreach for conducting a win-loss interview to how many actually hop on the line?
I'm trying to think of a specific program that I could give you a metric for. Obviously, losses are a little bit more tricky. And I want to say we have like is it 30%? I can't. This question's catching me a little bit off guard. I apologize. So on the DoubleCheck side, we have a dedicated team to help support the process, and we lean very heavily. Oh, good, I got it right. Thanks, Ryan. 30% loss. 60% win. But we lean very heavily on what we call our customer success team, and they manage all of the reaching out to targets and making sure that we secure those interviews. So that is very much in their wheelhouse, and I apologize, I didn't know that off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's it's a good point though, that it's not going to be perfect. You're not every single person you're going to reach out to isn't going to reply, but with that kind of benchmark data in mind, you can kind of have a idea, Raina, in terms of, okay, maybe there's something I can improve to get response rates up, because mine are a little bit lower than what we're seeing today.
And maybe consider other things like, are these relevant? Like how recent were they? Did they close recently or quite a long time ago? If it's the latter, they're probably not going to be apt to signing up for that. So just make sure they're, I think our recommendation is within 90 days of making a decision rather. So keep that in mind as well.
For sure, the timeliness aspect. Okay, we're coming up on the top of the hour here. So Brandon, Robyn, thank you so much for joining me. Folks that hopped on, anyone asking questions, anyone for just taking the time this morning to join us, I really, really, really appreciate it. Kicking off CE Live in 2023 with a bang. Recordings will be out tomorrow on the community platform with Compete Network, and also the audio version on the podcast feed. So check your inbox. everything will be over there. And if you have any other follow-up questions, things you don't think got answered, or you want to dive into more, reach out to myself, reach out to Brandon, Robyn. I'm assuming all on LinkedIn is probably the easiest way for us. And we love to do kind of post-mortem podcast episodes where we answer some more follow-up questions that we couldn't get to today. So don't be a stranger, reach out to us, and we'll catch you all next month. Thank you all. Robyn, Brandon, you're the best.
Thanks, everyone. This was
Thank
great.
you.